Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel or welcome to my channel. I'm Bird's Eye View Politics, and in this video I'm going to be continuing my coverage of the war in Ukraine. So let's start with this news from just a few days ago, but increasingly it's being distributed throughout the press, that the referenda in occupied territories such as Kharkiv or Kherson are being postponed indefinitely, as well as referendums in the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. Originally, the idea was to carry them out in September. That was going to essentially be September 11th, the single voting day in Russia, and it was named as the likely date. But obviously, Ukraine counterattacked throughout the region, retaking areas that had previously been Russian throughout Kharkiv and Luhansk, as well as making some further gains in Kherson, which, as I'd also said, was also previously completely controlled by Russia. So, obviously, good news for Ukraine in the referendums being called off for now. We also had one of the first groups of resistance since the beginning of the war in St. Petersburg. So usually oligarchs would essentially say, "Oh, I don't want the war," and then Putin would be a little bit mad at them and he would cause them some financial trouble and they'd give up and be like, "Oh yeah, you know what? War's fine." But in St. Petersburg, some local politicians called for Putin to be sacked or ousted or for him to resign over the war in Ukraine, half because he was handling the war badly and half because they didn't support the war. At least that's what they publicly said. More than likely, they all don't support the war. These groups of local politicians, many of them are from the Yabloko Party, which is the last pro-West, pro-Europe, liberal democratic party in Russia. And there's also been some from the Communist Party and the neo-fascist so-called Liberal Democratic Party who, while supporting the war, believe Putin has executed the war badly. Um, Essentially, a judge in Russia's rigged judicial system essentially said that some past council meetings were invalid and therefore they could just be broken up by the regional governor, who is a Putin ally, so of course that will happen. We also had news that the same council members, particularly Dmitry Payuga, then said the same court fined him 47,000 rubles, which is quite a lot in Russia, not that much in the United States, where it's for 780 US dollars for discrediting the authorities by calling for Putin's removal. So obviously no pretense of democracy there. Um, we also had news out of Ukraine, essentially that in the city of Izium, we had President Zelensky visit, which means not only do Ukraine control Izium, and Russia is obviously no longer in Izium, but it's also now safe enough, meaning there are very, very little Russian soldiers left behind Ukrainian lines at best, who could potentially hurt Zelensky or attack him. We also had news, of course, that there were explosions in areas in Donetsk, so that could potentially be major news if Ukraine is going to launch an attack in Donetsk as well, which would, of course, with the Kharkiv advance and a potential Luhansk advance, would knock out Russia's eastern bases and force them to resupply the regions in southern Ukraine that they control from Crimea. We also had news that Transnistria has been making increasing preparations both to stay out of the war but also to support Russia. We also had news, additionally, that air defenses have been active throughout the day in Odessa, which is yet another violation of the agreement signed by Ukraine, Russia, and intermediate partner, I guess, Turkey, which essentially allowed for Ukrainian grain to go through the Straits and the Black Sea and out to areas where it was needed, primarily in the Middle East and North Africa. That can't happen because Russia is now bombing the sea lanes. We also had news that Ukraine is still essentially bombing or shelling multiple Russian areas in key railroad or just highways in southern Ukraine, essentially halting Russia's supply network to the West Bank in Kherson due to these attacks, and also, of course, hurting the Russian morale in Donetsk, especially after Kharkiv had fallen. We also had news that people are getting wounded as a result of shelling in Belgorod, which is quite important because one, it means that Ukraine might actually be attacking Russians in Russia, which would obviously not be a good look for a country that wants to stand the defensive and maintain good reputation with its American and other NATO allies. But it could be significant if Ukraine is going to be able to launch attacks against Russia, because Russia is supposed to be at least the second or third largest power in the world, and they can't even beat Ukraine, who, bear in mind, isn't NATO supplied, but it's not like NATO troops are fighting Russian troops on the ground. So that's essentially all the updates I have. We have, of course, Russian resistance to Putin, mostly in the cities. We had the referendums that have now been postponed indefinitely, likely until at least November. We have, of course, previous Russian advances in the south and in the east being wiped out. And last but not least, we, of course, have continued news about Ukraine shelling or bombing major Russian supply centers. So, thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time.